So the occupation, the physical control that Israel exercises, for the most part directly, and then in terms of the Egyptian access indirectly, is not. It doesn't represent only that physical control or political control, if you will, but it also represents certain legal obligations that Israel therefore has. Now, a lot of the issues that I'll be referring to, or that one might refer to if one were looking at the overall military conflict, the armed conflict in Gaza, a lot of those things would apply no matter who the fighting parties were, in terms of, the responsibility, the obligation, for instance, not to target civilians, for example, the obligation not to indulge in collective punishment, for example. I mean, these are things that apply sort of no matter who the parties are. But because it's territory that Israel is still, by any reasonable legal reading of the situation, still is the occupying power, as the occupying power, it has additional obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention for protection of civilians living under its control, effectively, and for their welfare and their well-being, and providing and making sure, to an additional degree, that they have access to things like food, like health care, like safe water, and so forth. So that's an extremely important point to remember, because I think so much of the discussion, certainly in this country and outside of the region generally, is the discourse would suggest that we're talking about these hostile entities, and indeed they are hostile entities, but the ones in which, it's as if, the United States and Mexico got into a fight, or perhaps, there's Russia and Georgia or something like that. And it's really, it's legally speaking, as well as in sort of very physical ways, it's a very different situation. So 1.5 million people living in a very contained area. And the contained aspect of that is important, too, because unlike, for instance, in other armed conflict situations involving, say, a state like Israel and an armed group like Hamas or other Palestinian factions, as well as, of course, conflicts between armies belonging to states, in most situations you can think of, take Iraq, for instance, over the last 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, people, for all the harm that's come down on individuals, on civilians in that society, I mean, people have been able to flee. They've been able to get out of Iraq. Not all that wanted to, for sure. But there was that, if you will, safety valve. And certainly within Iraq, as we know, there are millions of displaced Iraqis. And not to sort of sanction that displacement, but the fact is that they were able to leave the neighborhoods they were living in. In many cases, they were driven out of those neighborhoods. And yes, there are, the criminal activity that one can talk about behind that displacement. But nevertheless, the contrast with Gaza is simply this. In Gaza, there was no place to flee, or the places to flee were even those places that people thought were safe, like the UN schools that were turned into temporary refuges and so forth, themselves came under fire. And then there are the reports that we've all read, I'm sure, about people who were pushed directly by the IDF out of one particular neighborhood and moved to another neighborhood, and then that neighborhood came under fire. So, this is what I think is really distinctive. One of the very distinctive features of the conflict in Gaza is this: the fact that the borders were completely sealed. People were unable to go anyplace outside. By the time the Israeli ground offensive started, Gaza was essentially divided between north and south into two or three sectors, in which movement was it was impossible unless you were unless you were an ambulance or something like that, or some sort of rescue facility, and even then you weren't necessarily safe. So I think I just want to underscore that, because that's something that's really not in our document here. I don't think, or if it is, it's simply referred to in passing. But I think it's one of the really distinctive features about this particular conflict when we talk about what is the impact, the humanitarian impact on the civilian population. I'm not sure actually how much I actually need to review what's in the document I provided to you. I'd just say this, that Gaza, in our view, was in a humanitarian crisis well before this military operation began on December 27th. We said so repeatedly. Israeli colleague organizations like B'Tselem and Gisha said so loudly and repeatedly, and in fact brought complaints to the Israeli High Court on the restrictions, the border, the closures of the border crossings, the cutbacks on fuel for electricity and other power purposes, and so forth. So this is in Israel, I think, much more, and of course in the occupied Palestinian territories, much more so certainly than in this country. The humanitarian crisis was well understood. Now, that, of course, didn't prevent the Israeli government from denying that there was a humanitarian crisis, something they continued to do well into the military operation itself, which, frankly, what do words mean anymore if there's not a humanitarian crisis in Gaza? Wherever was there one, or wherever is there one? And it's clear that in the period of the blockade, particularly that sort of 19-month period prior to, after 19 months being the period after Hamas won the elections, assumed authority, formed the government in Gaza, Haniya became prime minister, and so forth. So that's the period, that was the starting point, if you will. And as I suggested earlier, there were very serious closures and interruptions of the border crossings in the months and, in fact, years before that. But with Hamas's takeover, if you will, Hamas is coming to power through elections, and then there was one sort of ratcheting. The other one, of course, came in June 2007 when the Hamas-Fatah fighting took place, and Hamas was essentially dispatched from Gaza as a political and police military security force.